I never thought a single evening could change my entire life, until the night he appeared, leaning against my old clinic gate, bruised and broken in ways I couldn't name. I froze. His eyes met mine, stormy and quiet, and something inside me trembled, something I wasn't ready to feel. I'm just a village nurse. That's all I've ever been. My world is small, measured in routine and responsibility, in the rhythm of bandages and fevers, in the quiet smell of antiseptic mingling with damp earth after a fresh rain. I've always thought that was enough. That was safe. I knew where my days would take me, what faces I'd see, what hands I'd hold, and what nights I'd fall asleep to. Safe, predictable, ordinary. And I liked it that way. Or at least, I told myself I did. Until the night he appeared. It started with the sound of tires crunching against the gravel outside my clinic. I was counting supplies when I noticed a figure leaning against the gate, hunched in a way that made my stomach knot. At first, I thought he was just another traveler. But then he moved, slowly, limping, and the sudden sharpness of his presence hit me like ice water. I froze. My hands hovered over the ledger, heart hammering like a warning drum. Who was this man? Why was he here? My instinct screamed to run back inside, to lock the doors, to hide behind my routine, but my body didn't move. My curiosity rooted me to the spot. His eyes met mine. Stormy, unreadable, quiet but so intense it felt like he could see right into me. I should have looked away, should have pretended I didn't notice him, but I couldn't. Something inside me stirred, something I wasn't ready to name, something I had been trying to ignore my whole life. Please. I need help, he said, voice low, strained. There was pain in his tone, yes, but also a kind of raw honesty I rarely saw. And beneath it all, a warmth. A vulnerability that made my chest tighten and my pulse accelerate. I didn't even know his name, and already I felt a dangerous pull toward him. Come inside, I said, my voice steadier than I felt, though my hands trembled as I held the door open. I can help. He hesitated a fraction too long, and my stomach lurched. Was he suspicious? Afraid? Or worse, hiding something? The tension in the air was unbearable, a kind of electricity that made my skin itch. I don't want to cause trouble, he whispered, his eyes darting to the ground. I need help. You won't, I assured him softly. I promise. Just, trust me. I guided him inside, and as he limped toward the cot in the corner, I noticed the way he moved. Cautious, almost too measured. Every step deliberate. Every breath careful. And every time our hands brushed, accidental or not, I felt a jolt of heat that I had no control over. I shouldn't have stared at him while I cleaned his wounds. I shouldn't have noticed the small things, the tremor in his fingers, the slight catch in his breath, the way his eyes softened when he looked at me. I shouldn't have let my heartbeat spike every time his fingers brushed mine. But I did. I couldn't help it. And I hated myself for it. I hated how much I wanted him to stay. How much I needed him to stay. You're bleeding pretty badly, I murmured, keeping my voice low so as not to alarm him. How did this happen? He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he let out a shaky exhale and said, almost under his breath, "It's complicated." I tilted my head, sensing that was both an answer and a refusal. "Try me," I said gently. "I've seen a lot of complicated things." He gave a faint, humorless smile. "Not like this," he muttered. Then, softer, I shouldn't even be here." "I'm glad you are," I said before I could stop myself. The words tumbled out, reckless and unguarded. My stomach flipped at the admission. I hadn't meant for it to sound like that. Too much, too soon. But there it was, hanging in the air between us. He looked at me, really looked at me, and it was like a jolt had shot through my chest. My heart stuttered in a way that made the world seem impossibly quiet. The kind of quiet that presses against your ears, against your skin, making you hyper-aware of every little sound, every tiny motion. Something flickered in his eyes, a mixture of surprise, gratitude, and something else. Something I wasn't ready to understand. My stomach twisted at the sight, and for a moment I could hardly breathe. You're kind, he said quietly, voice low and rough with fatigue, yet soft in a way that made my chest constrict even more. It's unexpected. Kindness. That single word lingered in the room like smoke, twisting in the air, impossible to ignore. I felt it settle around us, wrapping the small clinic room in a tension that was almost tangible. And suddenly, everything shifted. Suddenly, my small, safe world, the routine I had wrapped around myself like armor, the predictable rhythm of bandages, fevers, the scent of antiseptic and rain-soaked earth, felt like a cage. Because in that word, in that moment, I realized I didn't want safety anymore. Not if this raw, dangerous, electrifying presence was what danger felt like. Not if it meant him. From that night, I began noticing him in ways I hadn't before. Not just the obvious, the strong jawline, the dark hair plastered against his forehead by sweat and rain, but the little things, the quiet, subtle movements that seemed almost instinctive. How he flinched slightly whenever I brushed his arm accidentally. How he inhaled sharply whenever I leaned closer to examine a wound, like he hadn't realized just how close I'd come. How, even in pain, even with cuts and bruises and exhaustion etched into his features, he tried to make conversation. Always asking about the village, the weather, my patients. Always trying to draw me into his world with the gentlest of questions, soft as whispered prayers. "You've lived here long?" he asked one evening, voice hoarse but soft, as if even speaking took effort. "All my life," I admitted, feeling a blush creep up my neck. "It's peaceful. Mostly." I laughed nervously, the sound too light for the weight in my chest, and he smiled faintly in response. That smile, small, almost imperceptible, made my chest ache in a way I couldn't name. It wasn't just desire. It wasn't just longing. It was something older, deeper, something that whispered of home, of safety, of belonging. "Peaceful, yes, but lonely, maybe," he said, and I noticed the slight catch in his throat, the way his eyes shifted away for just a fraction of a second, as though the words belonged to him as much as to me. There was a subtle tremor in his voice, a hidden weight, and it felt like he was speaking to me, yes, but also speaking to some shadow of himself I wasn't supposed to see. I wanted to ask him what he meant. I wanted to probe, to understand, to tear through the quiet walls he had wrapped around himself. But I didn't. I stayed silent, letting the tension stretch between us, letting the unspoken words hover in the air, heavy and dangerous. Instead, I wrapped the edge of a clean bandage around his arm, careful not to touch him too much, careful not to betray the way my fingers trembled when they hovered near his skin. He caught the movement, noticed the hesitation, and smiled faintly again, a ghost of something vulnerable flickering in his gaze. "You're careful," he said softly. "Like you don't want to hurt me." I froze for a moment, trying to breathe normally, trying to convince myself it was just about wounds and bandages, not the storm swirling in my chest. I don't," I whispered. "Not on purpose." He tilted his head slightly, eyes soft, piercing. "Not on purpose, but you feel it anyway, don't you?" I swallowed hard, heat rising to my face. "Feel what?" I asked, voice barely audible, though I knew he already knew. "The tension between us," he murmured, almost shyly. "The kind you can't ignore." It was true. I could feel it. Every nerve ending seemed alive, every heartbeat echoing through my chest, every breath shallow and quick. It was impossible to ignore, impossible to deny, and yet terrifying. Because this wasn't just attraction. This was something more. Something that pressed against every rule I had built around my life, every caution I had wrapped around my heart. Something that threatened to shatter the walls I had painstakingly constructed. And the thing is, I didn't want to stop it. I began noticing him in the quietest, most intimate moments. When he winced, even slightly, as I tended to his wounds. When he inhaled sharply as I leaned closer to examine a cut, just brushing his skin. When he asked questions about the small, ordinary details of my life, as if the mundane could bridge the distance between us. I caught myself memorizing everything, the way he tilted his head, the faint crease at the corner of his eyes when he smiled, the subtle cadence of his voice, the scent of rain and soap that clung to him. "You really know this place," he said one night, voice low, almost wistful. "Every corner, every street." "All my life," I repeated softly, the words heavier than I intended. "I've never left. Never needed to. And yet, I did need something now. Something I hadn't known I was missing until him." His presence had rewritten the rules of my ordinary life, had made my small village world feel like a prison, a place too quiet, too still, too safe. And I realized then, with an ache in my chest I couldn't name, that I didn't want safety anymore. Not if it meant never feeling this, the danger, the thrill, the unspoken intimacy, the quiet pull of hearts that had been waiting for each other without knowing it. He leaned back slightly, watching me with that same intensity, that mixture of gratitude and something deeper, something that both terrified and enthralled me. "It's strange," he said quietly, voice roughened by fatigue, by restraint. "I never expected to find someone like you here. Not in this quiet place. Not in this ordinary life. And yet, here you are." I felt my breath catch, my stomach twist, my hands go cold. "Here I am," I whispered, though the words felt fragile, inadequate, like they couldn't hold the weight of what I was feeling. His eyes softened, and for a heartbeat, I saw something I hadn't seen before, a vulnerability, almost childlike, hidden beneath the strength and calm he usually projected. You make it easier," he said. "Even when everything else feels impossible. You make it feel like I can breathe." The confession cut through me, jagged and raw. My chest tightened, my heart threatening to leap from my ribs. I wanted to reach for him, to pull him into me, to erase the space that separated us. But fear held me back. Fear of vulnerability, of desire, of letting him see the part of me that had always been fragile, lonely, unspoken. I clenched my fists around the edge of the counter. I don't know what to say," I admitted, voice trembling. "Because I feel it too. I can't stop noticing you. I can't. I don't want to." He took a step closer, closer than I expected, and I felt the heat from his body radiate toward me. "I don't want you to stop," he said simply. "Not now. Not ever." And in that moment, the world shrank. The clinic, the rain outside, the quiet village, all of it disappeared until there was only him. Only the way his eyes searched mine. Only the way his voice trembled slightly, betraying the restraint he had tried to maintain. Only the way my heart screamed in my chest, demanding, needing, wanting. It was dangerous. It was messy. It was everything I had been afraid of. And yet, I wanted it. I wanted him. I wanted the ache, the tension, the impossible pull between us. I wanted the storm, the vulnerability, the beauty of it all. And so I let myself notice him. In every quiet moment, in every small gesture, in every shared glance, in the way he breathed when I came near, in the faint, almost imperceptible smiles that flickered across his face when I spoke. I memorized it all, because I knew. I couldn't unsee it, couldn't unknow it, couldn't stop feeling it. Because in that quiet village, under the heavy sky, with rain-streaked windows and the scent of antiseptic in earth and longing heavy in the air, I realized something terrifying and exhilarating. I didn't want to go back to safety anymore. Not if danger felt like this. Not if this quiet intensity, this unspoken connection, this impossible, aching, magnetic pull, was what it meant to be alive. Not if it meant him. I wanted to ask what he meant. My throat itched with the words, clawing at me, demanding to be spoken, yet when I opened my mouth, nothing came out. The fear of sounding foolish, of letting him see how deeply I was unraveling, paralyzed me. I swallowed hard, tried to force a laugh, tried to anchor myself in the mundane task of arranging clean bandages, but my hands shook too much for that to work. Instead, I nodded. Quietly, almost imperceptibly, letting the motion speak the things I couldn't say. Sometimes, I admitted softly, voice barely more than a whisper, not realizing how vulnerable I sounded. Vulnerable in a way that terrified me, because vulnerability meant exposure. It meant letting someone see the cracks I had carefully concealed for years. And here he was, standing in that small, ordinary clinic, looking at me like he could see right through me. His gaze held me in place. I felt the air thicken around us, heavy and suffocating in a way that was almost pleasurable, if I dared admit it. I could sense the quiet electricity pulsing between us, subtle and constant, like a storm held in the stillness. My pulse spiked when I realized that something had shifted, irrevocably. Something unspoken had anchored itself between us, delicate but unyielding, and I knew, without a doubt, that nothing between us would ever be ordinary. Not after this. Not after him. I tried to focus on the task at hand, pretending to sort the bandages while sneaking glances at him. His presence was overwhelming, yet there was a softness I couldn't ignore. Something fragile, carefully hidden behind the tension of his posture, the slight limp in his step, the way he ran a hand over the back of his neck nervously, like he wasn't sure if he was allowed to be here at all. The next day, he returned. I didn't see it coming. I hadn't been expecting him so soon, hadn't allowed myself to hope. But there he was, walking up the narrow path toward the clinic, rain-specked hair plastered to his forehead, dark eyes catching mine almost immediately. He moved with a cautious strength, limping slightly, yet his shoulders were squared, his jaw tight with determination. There was a confidence in him I hadn't noticed before, or perhaps I hadn't allowed myself to see. I shouldn't ask, he said, voice low, hesitant, almost shy. But, could you help me with the bandages again tonight? The words hit me like a jolt. My chest twisted, squeezed, fluttered all at once. He was asking, not demanding. Hesitant, careful, almost shy. He wasn't commanding me, wasn't expecting anything beyond my consent. And yet, just the thought of touching him, of being near him again, made my pulse explode against my ribcage. I found myself nodding before I could overthink it. Of course, I said softly, voice trembling despite my effort to stay calm. Every movement that night felt magnified. Every step he took toward me seemed deliberate, careful, but with an undercurrent of urgency I could feel in the tremor of his hands, in the slight hitch of his breath when our eyes met. My hands moved automatically, cleaning his wounds, adjusting the bandages, tying knots with practiced precision, but my attention was stolen again and again by the quiet magnetism in his gaze. I could feel the heat of his skin beneath my fingertips, smell the faint mix of antiseptic and his own musky scent, hear the uneven rhythm of his breathing. And every time our hands brushed, every time our eyes locked, it was like a spark igniting a small fire inside me. A fire that I wanted to contain, but couldn't, because the truth was simple and terrifying. I was completely, utterly undone by him. You really care, he said suddenly, breaking the silence. The words were low, almost accusatory, almost in disbelief, like he couldn't comprehend why someone like me would care about someone like him. Even though you barely know me. I froze, his words reverberating in my chest. I wanted to explain, to defend myself, to make him understand, but the right words didn't exist. Instead, I swallowed hard, letting the pulse in my throat remind me how alive I felt, how raw. I do, I admitted finally, voice shaking slightly, but honest. And then, before I could stop myself, before I could retreat behind the walls I had so carefully built, I added, almost under my breath, it's my job. And I like to help people. I hated how inadequate that sounded. How small it seemed compared to the storm I felt inside. But his eyes softened. There was a flicker of something in them, a shadow of relief, a faint vulnerability, a recognition of the truth I had tried to mask. And I saw a glimpse of him there, not the guarded stranger, not the wounded soldier, but the man beneath. He shifted slightly closer, the limp in his step almost imperceptible now, and I felt my own body lean toward him despite my best efforts. It was like gravity had changed. Everything I had believed about caution, about boundaries, about safety, it didn't matter here. Not with him. Not when his presence pressed against my chest like a promise, a challenge, a confession. "You're unexpected," he said again, softly, almost in awe. His gaze lingered, piercing and gentle at the same time. I didn't expect anyone to see me. To care. I faltered, fingers hovering over the bandage, suddenly aware of every detail, the texture of his skin, the warmth of his arm, the way the light in the small clinic flickered across his features. I didn't expect to either, I admitted. But I do. Care, I mean. He let out a breath I hadn't realized he had been holding, a sound like relief, like recognition, like hope. And suddenly, the small space between us was charged, alive, electric. The hum of the lights, the distant rustle of leaves outside, the faint scent of antiseptic and rain, all of it became secondary to the tension curling through the air, tangible, dangerous, impossible to ignore. "You make it easier," he said quietly, almost to himself. "Even when everything else feels impossible. You make it feel like I can breathe." The words lodged in my chest, heavy and sharp. My heartbeat thundered in my ears, my fingers went rigid around the bandage, yet I couldn't pull away. Couldn't stop myself from meeting his gaze. Couldn't stop the heat rising in my chest, the flutter of desire, the ache of longing I had tried to contain. I want to help," I whispered, almost pleading. "Not because I have to. Because I want to." His hand twitched, almost instinctively, toward mine, but stopped short, hovering in the space between us. The hesitation, the restraint, the carefulness, it was all part of him. And yet, it only made my pulse spike faster, made the ache in my chest sharper. He started, voice faltering, then steadied himself. "You're not like anyone I've met. Not just because you're kind, but because you see me. You see me, really." I swallowed, feeling the lump of vulnerability rise in my throat. "I see you," I admitted, voice trembling. "All of you." The confession hung in the air like a fragile thread, trembling but unbreakable. I could feel him leaning slightly toward me, his gaze softening, the tension in his jaw easing, a subtle exhale of surrender passing between us. And I knew in the marrow of my bones, that this moment had changed everything. Because care had become more than duty. Because proximity had become something intimate, almost dangerous. Because the quiet, ordinary village clinic had transformed into the stage for something neither of us could have predicted, something that had been quietly growing, like embers in the dark, waiting for the spark. And I wanted that spark. I wanted him. I wanted the ache, the tension, the heat, the impossible pull that had quietly taken root in both of us. I wanted to feel alive in a way I hadn't known before. Even if it scared me. Even if it was reckless. Even if it meant shattering the fragile sense of safety I had once clung to. Because for the first time, I didn't want safety. I wanted him. He chuckled softly, a sound rough around the edges from fatigue but warm, somehow comforting. It resonated in the small, quiet room in a way that made my chest constrict, a familiar ache that I couldn't name. "I mean, I like that you care," he said, voice low, almost hesitant, as if admitting something vulnerable was an effort. "Really care. It's rare." The words lingered between us, fragile as glass, suspended in the air like a secret waiting to be uncovered. My stomach nodded. My hands, still holding the bandage, trembled slightly, betraying the calm I was trying to project. I should have looked away. I should have focused on the task at hand, tied the knots, smoothed the folds, washed the cuts with measured care. But I didn't. My gaze lingered, drawn magnetically to him. I couldn't look away, even if I wanted to. I traced the curve of his jaw, the line that carried the faint shadow of stubble. I noticed the tension in his shoulders, the subtle way his chest rose and fell with controlled breaths, the faint tremor in his hands as he rested them near mine. And then there were his eyes, dark, stormy, alive in a way that made my heart twist. They seemed to darken when he looked at me directly, deep pools I could drown in if I let myself. I swallowed hard, feeling the air catch in my throat. My heartbeat, already racing from proximity and unspoken desire, picked up pace like a drum threatening to burst from my chest. Every nerve ending seemed alive, hyper-aware of him, of his scent, the warmth radiating from his skin, the faint tang of antiseptic mixed with rain that clung to him like a memory. And then, his hand brushed mine. Not accidentally. I felt the intentionality in the touch before I even realized it was happening. Tentative, careful, almost questioning. Just enough to make my breath catch, to make my chest hammer against the confines of my ribs. My pulse surged as if it had its own life, independent of reason or caution. Why am I like this? I whispered to myself, barely audibly, the words trembling through the quiet room. My voice sounded foreign, fragile, raw, exposing the part of me I'd kept locked away for years. Why do I feel this? He didn't answer. Not with words, at least. He only held my gaze a fraction longer than expected, the air between us thick with a tension I could almost taste. It was unspoken, indescribable, but undeniable. The kind of connection that defies explanation, that roots you in a moment, a place, a feeling so intense that the world outside ceases to exist. I could feel the warmth lingering long after his hand pulled back, a ghostly echo of the brush that left my skin buzzing. Every cell in my body seemed alive to him, to his nearness, to the forbidden intimacy of that single touch. My fingers tingled as though they had absorbed his energy, my heart still stammering with the memory of it, and my chest ached for more. I tried to rationalize it. Tried to tell myself it was just circumstance, just nerves, just the shared vulnerability of tending to wounds. But my mind wouldn't be satisfied with excuses. My body wouldn't. My heart certainly wouldn't. Because what I felt was undeniable. It was consuming, magnetic, impossible to ignore. "You're dangerous," I whispered under my breath, a confession I didn't mean for him to hear. Not yet. Not aloud. Dangerous, because he had the power to unravel me in ways no one else ever had. Dangerous, because he made my safe, ordinary world feel unbearably small. Dangerous, because I couldn't resist him even if I tried. I watched him shift, his gaze still fixed on me, just long enough to make my chest tighten further. There was a subtle hesitancy in him now, as if he, too, understood the intensity of that single brush of skin. The quiet room felt charged, alive, like the seconds themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something to break the spell or ignite it further. I leaned slightly forward, almost unconsciously, my fingers brushing against his just for a fraction of a second longer than necessary. The heat of our proximity, the mingling of scents, earth after rain, the faint antiseptic sting, the warmth of him, made my head spin. My thoughts scrambled, rationality slipping, replaced with an urgent, aching longing that was nearly painful in its intensity. I shouldn't feel like this, I muttered, more to myself than to him, words spilling in a soft tremor. I shouldn't want this. I shouldn't want you. But the truth was undeniable. I did. Every fiber of my being did. My chest constricted with the ache of wanting, of needing, of desiring something I wasn't supposed to have, something that could destroy the delicate balance of my life, yet something that had rooted itself so firmly I couldn't imagine letting it go. He leaned slightly closer, almost imperceptibly, and I felt the shift in the air. The tension stretched taut, electric. My breath caught, shallow and quick, my pulse thrumming in my ears, every sense heightened. The faint scrape of his clothes, the slight inhale he drew, the way his gaze held mine, each detail magnified, intoxicating, impossible to ignore. "You're not like anyone I've met," he said finally, voice low, almost reverent. Not just because you're kind, but because you see me. Really see me." I felt heat creep up my neck, a blush I couldn't hide, though I tried. I see you," I admitted, voice trembling. "All of you." His eyes softened in response, and my chest tightened further. That vulnerability, the unguarded honesty in him, was both terrifying and exhilarating. I could feel the quiet storm brewing between us, a tension that was both dangerous and beautiful, impossible to resist. And then it happened, another fleeting, tentative brush of his hand against mine. This time, I didn't pull away. My fingers lingered against his, aware of the heat, the tension, the unspoken confession contained in the contact. My pulse surged, and for a moment, I felt suspended in time. The room, the rain outside, the scent of antiseptic and wet earth, it all faded until there was nothing but us, nothing but the small, fragile thread connecting our hands, our hearts, our unspoken desires. "Why now?" I whispered under my breath, heart hammering. "Why now, when I know I shouldn't, when I can't?" He didn't answer with words, only with the intensity of his gaze, the subtle way his hand moved in response to mine, the silent acknowledgement that he, too, felt the same impossibly dangerous pull. And that silent acknowledgement was enough. Enough to make me tremble. Enough to make me ache. Enough to make me realize that nothing would ever be the same again. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the sensation wash over me, the warmth, the tension, the magnetic, destructive beauty of it. I wanted to stop it. I wanted to deny it. I wanted to retreat into the safety of routine, the predictable rhythm of my life. But I couldn't. Because he had touched me, not just with his hand, but with his presence, his gaze, the quiet, undeniable way he had rooted himself into my world. And the truth I couldn't ignore, the truth that throbbed like a pulse in my chest, was this: I wanted him. All of him. Even the danger. Even the uncertainty. Even the forbidden, fragile tension that stretched between us like a live wire. Because nothing in my life had ever felt this alive. Nothing had ever felt this, like him. Days passed. Every evening became a fragile ritual. He arrived, I tended to his wounds, and the air between us grew heavier, more charged. I found myself anticipating his arrival, checking the road before he even turned the corner, imagining the sound of his car before it reached the gravel. I look forward to seeing you," I admitted one night, my voice barely more than a whisper. My fingers trembled as I tied a bandage around his arm. He paused. Just paused. And I wanted to die from the tension, the weight, the unsaid words hanging between us. Then he looked up, eyes dark and intense, and murmured, I feel the same." Heat pulled in my chest, and for a moment, I thought I might faint. My world had always been small, safe, predictable. But he made it explode in color, in fire, in longing I couldn't name. I should have resisted. I told myself, countless times, that he was temporary, that he belonged to another life, that I was nothing but a nurse in a quiet village. But every time he spoke, every time he smiled, every time he touched me, lightly, cautiously, I felt something breaking open inside me. Something wild, something desperate, something entirely uncontainable. Every evening, he returned. Like clockwork, like some quiet ritual I hadn't realized I was living for. The sun would dip behind the hills, painting the sky in bruised shades of orange and violet, and I'd find myself glancing down the winding dirt road, heart hammering, hoping, praying, that he'd come. The driver from the nearby town, everyone said. Polite, careful, a man of habits and quiet words. But to me, he was more. So much more than anyone I'd allowed into my life. The first time he offered me a ride, I hesitated. The car was warm, the interior smelling faintly of leather and rain-damp air. He handed me a towel to wipe my hands, his fingers brushing mine for the barest moment. My breath hitched, and I prayed he hadn't noticed the way my chest tightened, how the sudden warmth in my veins spread like fire. "You okay back there?" he asked softly, voice low, gentle, but edged with a kind of concern that made my stomach twist in a way I hadn't felt in years. It was like he'd touched something inside me without touching me at all, and I hated that I wanted more. I'm fine," I replied, but my voice betrayed me. I could hear the slight tremor. Could he feel it? I dared not look, afraid that our eyes might meet and something unspoken would shatter the careful walls I'd built around myself. From that night on, the rides became my reason to wait. Every evening, I imagined his car rounding the bend, imagined the crunch of gravel under tires, imagined the warmth of his presence sitting beside me. I told myself it was just the kindness, the worry, the human instinct to care for someone fragile. I told myself 1,000 times that it didn't mean anything, that it wasn't dangerous. But longing doesn't ask permission. Longing creeps in, slow, insidious, filling every corner of your mind until there's no room for anything else. One evening, the sky dark and heavy with rain, I ran a hand through my hair, already anxious before he arrived. My pulse sped the moment I saw his headlights flicker through the drizzle. He parked a little closer than usual, a faint grin tugging at the corners of his lips. "You're early," I said, my voice trembling more than I wanted. "Traffic was lighter than I expected," he replied, and there was a pause, a hesitation that made my stomach twist. His eyes softened as they met mine. "Are you nervous?" I swallowed hard. "Maybe a little." That was an understatement. My whole body had been betraying me for weeks. My hands shook even as I placed them on my lap, and every time he smiled, my resolve crumbled a little more. He leaned back, casual but deliberate, and I could feel the warmth radiating from him. "You're kind," he said quietly, almost to himself. I don't meet many people like you." The words pierced me. Something inside me cracked, and I wanted to tell him everything I'd been hiding from myself. But I couldn't. I didn't dare. So I stayed silent, fingers curling into the fabric of my dress, fighting the urge to reach out, to close the space between us. Days passed, and each ride became more unbearable, more intoxicating. I started noticing the small things, the way he'd glance at me through the rearview mirror, the slight tremble in his voice when he laughed softly at a joke I barely made, the faint scent of soap and rain that clung to him. Each detail, tiny as it was, became a thread that pulled me closer to him. "You look tired," I said one evening, unable to stop myself. "I've been driving," he replied, shrugging lightly, as though it was nothing. But his eyes betrayed him, they were dark and tired, and there was a vulnerability there that made me ache. "But seeing you makes it worth it." My chest caught. I wanted to ask him what he meant, to pull him close, to tell him that I felt the same, but I didn't. Words failed me. Instead, I nodded, pretending calm, though my heart felt like it would burst. The tension between us grew, quiet but undeniable. Every evening, every shared glance, every accidental brush of his hand against mine added fuel to a fire I had no right to ignite. I kept reminding myself, he's hurt, fragile, temporary. I'm just a nurse. He has a world I cannot enter. He's not mine. But then he smiled that quiet smile, the one that lingered in my mind long after he'd gone. It wasn't a grin, not really, it was something gentler, something that spoke of unspoken truths and hidden depths. And every time it appeared, every time those eyes lingered on me a fraction too long, my resolve crumbled. I look forward to seeing you," I admitted one night, my voice barely above a whisper. My hands were trembling, and I felt exposed, raw in a way that terrified me. He didn't answer immediately, and the silence that followed was unbearable. I wanted to demand a response, to break the tension, but I couldn't. Instead, I sat still, heart pounding, waiting for him to speak. And when he finally did, his eyes were dark and intense, heated in a way that made my knees weak. "I feel the same," he said softly. Everything in me wrenched. Desire, fear, longing, all tangled into a tight knot I couldn't untangle. I should have resisted. I tried. I told myself 1,000 times that he wasn't mine, that he belonged to another world, that I was just a village nurse, trapped in a life of quiet predictability. I repeated it in my head like a mantra: stay calm, stay rational, stay safe. But my thoughts betrayed me. Every time he spoke, every time his hand brushed mine, every time his voice softened, I felt the world shift. My quiet, small life suddenly seemed too narrow, too dim, too ordinary. And I hated how much I wanted more. I hated how reckless I was allowing myself to feel. One evening, the rain was falling heavier than usual, hammering against the car roof like a drumbeat of tension. He drove slower than usual, glancing at me in the rearview mirror more frequently than necessary. The air between us was thick, electric. "You've been distant today," he said suddenly, voice rougher than usual. "Something wrong?" I wanted to lie, to tell him nothing, to maintain the fragile calm I had left. But I couldn't. I'm scared, I admitted, whispering, almost ashamed. Scared of feeling too much. He turned slightly in his seat, eyes locking with mine. "You don't have to be afraid of me," he said quietly, reaching just enough to brush his hand against mine. "I'm not going anywhere." Heat pulled in my chest, and for a moment, I wanted to surrender completely. To let go of all my rules, all my fears, all the walls I had built around myself. But I couldn't, not yet. Not until I knew that he wasn't just a passing presence, that he wasn't fragile, that he wasn't temporary. Why him? I whispered to myself later that night, lying awake in the quiet of my small bedroom. Why now? Why me? Every day was a battle between desire and reason. Every evening, I waited. Every glance, every word, every accidental touch, fuel for a fire I couldn't put out. I wanted to tell him everything. I wanted to confess that he had already taken over my heart, that I couldn't stop thinking about him, that the simple act of his presence made my blood run hotter. But I stayed silent. I waited for him to say it first. To give permission. To allow me to feel safe enough to cross that invisible line. And yet, in every quiet moment, I felt it, the pull. That dangerous, sweet pull that made me ache and tremble and wonder if I'd ever be the same again. We shouldn't have been together. He belonged to a world of roads, orders, obligations. I belonged to the quiet rhythm of this village, to predictable nights and ordinary days. But longing doesn't ask permission. It seeps in. Creeps into every corner of your mind. Clings to your thoughts like a shadow you can't escape. One evening, he turned to me, eyes catching the last streaks of twilight, and said, I think I've been waiting for you." I froze, chest constricting, unable to breathe. "Waiting, for me?" I whispered, barely audible. He nodded, just barely, a small, tentative nod that made my entire world tilt. I don't know how else to say it. But every day, every ride. I look for you. I hope you'll be there. I need you. And just like that, the dam inside me broke. My hands shook. My chest burned. The fire I had tried to contain exploded in waves I couldn't control. I've been waiting too, I confessed, voice trembling with all the fear, longing, and reckless hope I'd been hiding. Every evening. I've been waiting for you. He reached over, hand brushing mine again, and this time, I didn't pull away. I couldn't. The car seemed to shrink around us, the rain outside fading into insignificance. There was only him. Only me. Only the dangerous, beautiful, inevitable pull between us. Days passed. At first, I told myself that returning to routine would heal the ache. That work, bandaging wounds, checking fevers, tending to the sick, would fill the emptiness his absence had left behind. I tried to immerse myself in it, my hands moving almost automatically, my mind focusing on the tasks, the rituals that had once been my shield. But it was useless. Every time I wrapped a bandage, I imagined his hands instead. Large, warm, calloused in the perfect way that spoke of strength and endurance, yet gentle when it mattered. I imagined the way he would curl his fingers around mine, the slightest touch sending jolts through me, leaving me trembling and breathless. Every evening, I found myself waiting by the window, heart hammering at the faintest hint of headlights rounding the bend in the dirt road. I'd stare for what felt like hours, imagining his smile breaking the dusk, the way it softened his otherwise intense features. And every time I saw it in my mind's eye, I felt both comforted and agonized. Comforted because it existed, agonized because it wasn't real. Not yet. I tried to stay rational. I told myself he was gone. That the visits had ended. That I was imagining things that would never come to pass. I busied myself with cleaning, with paperwork, with the endless monotony of the village clinic. I told myself I could survive. That I could endure. That he had left me, and I would learn to forget. And then he came back. The first sound was the tires crunching on the wet gravel outside. My stomach lurched. I froze mid-step, the broom slipping slightly in my hands. My pulse raced, wild and erratic. I didn't dare hope, not yet. Maybe it was someone else. Maybe I was imagining things. But then I saw him. Rain streaked his hair, clinging to his forehead and temples. His clothes were damp, darkened by the downpour, and his eyes, scoured the village with a desperate intensity until they landed on mine. And in that instant, the world shrank. Everything else disappeared. The rain, the night, the chirping of crickets, the distant flicker of lights, it was as though the universe had conspired to make us the only two beings alive. I shouldn't have left, he said, voice rough, edged with emotion, raw in a way that made my chest ache. I realized. I can't. Every word hit me like a wave, pulling me under. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. My hands trembled despite my efforts to steady them. My heart was pounding so violently I feared he might hear it over the rain. You're here, I whispered, voice cracking. My body wanted to run to him, to collapse into his arms, to let the longing that had been caged inside me for days finally free. But even as I said it, I felt the tension in my chest, the lingering fear of how fragile this moment could be. His lips twitched, a faint, almost shy smile breaking through the intensity in his eyes. I shouldn't have left, he repeated, and this time, he stepped closer. His wet shoes splashed in the puddles, the sound sharp against the quiet of the village night. He was real. He was here. And every fiber of me wanted him. I didn't think. I didn't calculate the risks, the consequences, the fear that had held me back for days. I ran. My legs moved on their own accord, propelled by something deeper than logic or reason. Hands trembling, heart hammering, chest tight, I crossed the small courtyard that separated us, the rain drenching my hair, my clothes, my skin, but I didn't care. Not a bit. He didn't step back. He didn't hesitate. His eyes widened slightly as I collided with him, as if he hadn't allowed himself to believe this moment could actually happen. And then he wrapped his arms around me, pulling me into him with a force that made me gasp, made me feel whole and broken at the same time. Everything we had denied, the longing, the fear, the stolen moments, the unspoken words, crashed over us in a tidal wave. I felt it in his embrace, in the press of his chest against mine, in the warmth of him enveloping me. I felt it in the beat of his heart against my ear, in the trembling of his hands as they held me close, in the raw, jagged edge of everything we had tried to ignore. I thought I lost you, he whispered, voice thick, rough with emotion. I couldn't stay away anymore. I waited, I admitted, voice shaking. Every day. Every night. I couldn't stop thinking about you. His lips brushed my temple, then my forehead, then finally, he cupped my face in his hands, tilting my head toward his. The world narrowed to that single moment. My lungs forgot how to breathe. My hands trembled against his chest, gripping the fabric of his wet jacket as if it were a lifeline. And then our lips met. It wasn't gentle at first. It was desperate, aching, urgent. It was everything we had denied, everything we had feared, everything we had waited for, all pressed into a single, consuming kiss. The rain fell harder around us, drumming against the roofs, the windows, the earth, but we didn't hear it. We didn't see it. There was only him and me, only the warmth and the ache and the certainty that we had survived everything, every longing, every fear, every day apart, just to find this moment. I tasted the rain on his lips, the salt and the warmth, the danger and the safety all intertwined. My hands tangled in his hair, my body pressed against his as if trying to merge into him, to make up for every second we had lost. I felt him shiver against me, felt his heartbeat racing, felt the raw, trembling vulnerability that mirrored my own. When we finally pulled back, just barely, our foreheads pressed together, breath mingling, the world still spinning, I saw the reflection of the fire in his eyes. The same fire I had felt, the same fire I had imagined, had been alive in him all along. I thought I'd never see you again, he said, voice barely audible over the rain, but it was enough. Enough to make my knees weak, enough to make me tremble again, enough to remind me that we had been apart far too long. I waited, I whispered again, because it was all I could say. Words had failed us before, but now they were a promise, a confession, a surrender. He held me tighter, as if willing to imprint me into his very being. Then we don't have to be apart anymore, he said. And I believed him, because in that quiet village under the heavy sky, drenched in rain, with hearts pounding and breath ragged, nothing else mattered. Nothing else existed. We lingered there, in the storm, in the moment, in the collision of two hearts that had survived longing and fear. Every past doubt, every worry, every whispered thought of impossibility faded in the heat of the now. I felt the ache in my chest ease slightly, replaced by a warmth that spread through my entire being, a reassurance that even after everything, we had found each other. I wanted to memorize every detail, the way the rain clung to his hair, the soft intensity in his eyes, the strength in his arms, the slight tremor of his hands that betrayed how much he had held back. I wanted to memorize the taste of his lips, the sound of his voice, the way the world seemed to shrink until it was only him and me. I can't believe you're here, I whispered again, voice trembling, raw with everything I had felt in the days he was gone. I can't believe it either, he admitted, and I felt the words reverberate deep inside me. I wanted to be somewhere else, I tried to be, but there's no place for me but here. With you. The confession hung in the air, electric, undeniable. I felt tears prickle my eyes, not from sadness, but from relief, from the overwhelming realization that he had returned, that the ache had an end, that longing had finally been answered. I was so afraid you wouldn't come back, I admitted, burying my face against his chest, listening to the rapid beat of his heart. Afraid I'd have to live without this, without you. You don't have to, he whispered, pressing a kiss to the top of my head. Not ever. Not again. And there it was, the promise, fragile but fierce, raw but unbreakable. The warmth, the ache, the longing, all collapsed into a single truth, that we had survived everything just to find this moment. The rain continued to fall, drenching us, washing away the fear and the distance, leaving only the certainty of each other, the reality of everything we had denied, the undeniable pull of hearts meant to collide. And in that quiet village, under the heavy sky, I realized something I had always feared, that sometimes, love isn't gentle, isn't safe, isn't slow. Sometimes, love is a storm. And sometimes, you have to let yourself be drenched in it to survive it, to truly feel it. I never believed in fate. I thought life was a series of choices, a string of moments we could control, measure, predict. I thought love was something you planned for, something that arrived neatly and politely, with no surprises, no chaos, no heartbreak. But maybe I was wrong. Because here he was. Not because of timing, not because of some perfect plan, but because he found me. Bruised. Broken. Lost in my own quiet, ordinary world. And he refused to leave. Even when I tried to push him away, even when the fear of longing and desire made me tremble, he stayed. He stayed. And maybe that's what love is. Not always gentle. Not always rational. Not always safe. Sometimes it's dangerous. Sometimes it's messy. Sometimes it burns you up from the inside until you're raw and trembling and utterly helpless against it. And yet, it's beautiful. The way it aches in your chest, the way it steals your breath, the way it makes every heartbeat feel like it's the first time you've ever lived. The way it makes rain-soaked nights feel alive, makes stolen glances feel like declarations, makes words you don't say echo louder than anything anyone ever speaks. And maybe, just maybe, love is inevitable. Something that arrives whether you're ready or not, whether you fight it or embrace it, whether the world says it's possible or impossible. Something that latches onto you and refuses to let go, no matter how carefully you try to build your walls, no matter how rational you try to be, no matter how much you fear the consequences. I look back at the days I waited, the nights I dreamed, the moments I dared not speak. And I realize, it wasn't chance. It wasn't luck. It was him. It was us. And maybe that's all that matters. Because I can't stop. I don't want to. I've tried. But love is a dangerous, beautiful, inevitable thing. And for the first time, I don't want to stop it. If you felt this story, if it touched your heart, if it made you remember the ache and thrill of your own impossible love, make sure to subscribe for more stories like this. Hit like if your heart raced along with mine, comment below with the part that made you sigh, and share it with someone who believes in the dangerous, beautiful pull of love. Because love like this, it's meant to be shared.